Hey everybody, welcome to my presentation on planning for risk, which is part of INFS 6702 IT project management. Now risk is definitely something that project managers will want to look at, so this is a topic we'll dive into a little bit, especially as you're planning or putting together your very first project plan. I've got a brief agenda which covers a couple of topics. First, I want to define risk and risk attributes, also discuss continuous risk management process, then look at performing risk identification, what that looks like. We'll evaluate risks using a probability or an impact matrix, talk about how that works. Then look at applying countermeasures to help us mitigate risks. This is one of the methods that we can use. Finally, we'll look at the risk controlling process. We'll talk about 3 popular common risk management tools, and then I'll give you some pro tips that you can apply to your work immediately if you're in the project management space. What is risk? I'm going to use the PMI definition. An uncertain event or condition that, if occurs, has a positive or negative effect on a project's objectives. So some key things to pay attention to here are that it's an uncertain event. So it's something that we don't know is going to happen or not. And if it does occur, this event is going to have either positive or negative impact on our project outcomes. So positive or negative, that's kind of interesting because often we focus on the negative risks, but there are some positive risks that could happen as well. And if those occur, we also want to be ready to adapt our project to those circumstances. Now, risk attributes, we talked about a little bit in the definition, but diving a little bit deeper, we realize that there is an uncertain event or condition that happens. Another thing about risks is they have not yet happened, so they're in the future. The event that happens can either be positive or negative, and the event has some sort of consequence on our project outcomes and objectives. And there's a probability that this event will occur, and there's also something that you can do to mitigate or avoid this event from happening or avoid the outcome that might associate with this particular event. And your consequences of this event can either be accepted, right? You're fine with those, or you can try to maximize those. So if it's a positive event, you want to maximize the outcome of that to benefit the project, or you can minimize the risk to essentially avoid them or dampen the effects of that risk on your project. So let's talk about the continuous risk management processes. We have 4 processes starting at the very top. That's going to be risk identification, followed by risk evaluation, risk mitigation, and risk controlling. Now, you may be wondering what the differences are between these, and we'll talk about each one. So the very first one, risk identification, that's early on in the project. It's the first time you're going to encounter this. And really, you want all the members of the project team to gather and start identifying various risks. Now, there's a couple of ways we can do this. I'm going to talk about some of the strategies here next, but the key here is to come up with a long list of all the possible risks in your particular project. Now, some of the strategies we can apply here. First one, stakeholder involvement. You definitely want to bring in a representative from all the various stakeholder groups to provide impact. And generally, when you bring in a large group and they're having a conversation, a lot of times these risks will sort of bubble to the surface pretty quickly, and you can start capturing those. The next thing you really want to use is your experience. Now, as a project manager, you will have experience with several projects, kind of along the size of this one or similar to this one. Other PMs might as well. And so all of the PMs, everybody in the PMO office, people who have worked on similar projects, all will know kind of what kind of risks would occur in a project like this, so they can also help inform that risk identification process. Now, another thing that you'll want to do is an activity analysis. So if you think back to your work breakdown structure, you have these activities, and these are sort of the bottom layer activities, remember, across the bottom there on your big scope planning document. And so looking at that, you can take a look at all the activities and go through each of the activities, whoever those activities are assigned to, who is working on them, to identify particular risks in the activities. Now, the problem with this is oftentimes you're not going to identify risks that are involved when you pass off something, so an activity completes and you move to the next one. Those are often overlooked when you're deep in the weeds looking at an activity analysis, but hopefully those were identified in the stakeholder identification process, as well as your experience will hopefully also identify some of those. And now you're going to take all of these and you're going to start compiling them. Another thing you can do is the organization may have a risk repository of risks of previous projects that have been encountered. Maybe the organization doesn't have this, but you might have this as a project manager. And you can refer to these to also inform the possible risks that may occur in your particular project. So now you have a long list of risks, and the next thing we want to do is evaluate the risks. So we should classify the risks, determine the probability that the risk will occur, the impact, the exposure of our organization to the risk or of our project to the risk, and the time of impact. Is this the risk that's going to happen early on, or is this a risk more toward the end of the project? These are the kind of things we would like to identify when we evaluate our risks. So here are some examples of things we'll want to look at. The first one is going to be probability. So you're going to try to determine the probability of the event occurring. And sometimes you can have a calculation on a scale of 1 to 100. Sometimes I see a 7-point scale. I really recommend just having a very simple scale, high, medium, low, because a lot of times these values are going to be arbitrary unless you're doing a really sophisticated analysis. So if they're just arbitrary and they're based on team members' input, again, high, medium, low should be perfectly fine. Now next, you'll want to identify the impact. So if this risk occurs, how much of an impact is it going to have on the project? Is your entire project going to stop? If that's the case, I would say high. And if you'll barely notice this event happen in the overall project, or it's not going to shift any of your timelines, I would mark it as low. And then of course you can also have medium in that scale. I would recommend doing something along these lines. So one way to look at it too is if you're trying to come up with some numbers, you want to look at your procedures that you have for dealing with various risks. So for example, if something impacts your schedule for more than 2 weeks, you might identify that as a medium risk or as a high risk. Or if something increases your project cost by 10%, you could identify that as a high risk. And you can come up with these values that help you classify these risks. Now, another thing you want to look at is exposure. And essentially what you do here is you create this matrix called an impact probability matrix, and you essentially rate your probability and your impacts that you have. And you have your impacts on one side on the x-axis, for example, and your probability on the y-axis, and you compare and classify where things land. So if something has a high probability and a high impact, that's clearly something that you as a project manager want to be aware of and focus on. And if something has a low probability and a low impact, it may not even belong in your list of risks. So that's part of the evaluation. The next piece is determining when the risk may occur. So that's the time piece. Is this early on in the project, later in the project? You'll want to identify when that is. And then you want to go back, as I mentioned, to your documents and determine whether this is a risk or not. So if something, for example, is medium probability, low impact, again, you need to decide as a project manager whether that should still be a risk or not based on the documentation you have. Here's a great example of a risk table. So this is the probability impact matrix. I can fill this out for you with a few data points. So we've got columns called risk, probability, impact, exposure, and time frame. For the risk column at the very front, we simply label the type of risk, and I gave some examples there like insufficient talent or bad cost estimates. Then we enter in a probability. And again, I recommend just using a simple number, 3, 2, 1. So high is 3, medium is 2, 1 is low. And I entered in those values there. For insufficient talent, entered in a 3, which indicates high probability. Then for impact, the values are similar. So high, medium, low. If it's a high impact, I also gave it a 3. So now I have the 2 3s. Now I go over to my exposure column, and I have a guide there of determining what that exposure should be. So if it's less than 2, would mark it a low. If it's 3 to 4, that would be medium. And if it's greater than 5, it's a high exposure risk. So 3 plus 3 is 6. So again, that would be labeled high, and that's a high exposure risk. So insufficient talent is a big potential problem in our project. And the time frame of that is phase 1, which is the very first phase of our project. So that's an example of how you'd handle that. And of course, you would do that for every single risk that you identify. And in this particular example, I put a note at the very bottom of the exposure column that if something is labeled low, so bad cost estimates, for example, probability of 1, impact of 1, exposure is less than 2, or 2 in our case, that would be low. And then the time frame is phase 1. But since the exposure is low, I would remove this from the risk table. It's not a risk that we need to be concerned about, and we can focus and measure the risks that are of greater concern to us. Risk mitigation. Now, for risk mitigation, the first step is developing countermeasures. What do we do if we encounter a risk? What are the strategies that we do? We also identify the risk owners. Who's going to own this risk? And who's going to identify flags of this risk, and who's going to identify measures and make sure those measures are occurring so that we have information to apply our countermeasure, and some early warnings. So here's some strategies we use for risk mitigation. The first one, obviously, just mentioned, developing risk countermeasures. So there's a couple of rules that the countermeasures should have. One is that they should eliminate the risk if we can. They should lower the risk probability, and they should lower the risk impact. Now, we want to report the time and the cost of each of the responses. So if you have a countermeasure that costs you 20% of the project, that's going to be a very expensive countermeasure, and we want to capture that. Also, how long the countermeasure takes. If the countermeasure extends your project by 6 months, that may be pretty detrimental to the overall project. So again, you want to list that for each countermeasure, along with the time and cost for each countermeasure, so that when you hit that point and you're deciding which option to choose of your countermeasures, you can select the best one. Now, the second phase of this would be to identify risk flags that go along with that particular risk. So for example, if you're trying to hire someone, there might be some flags of we're not hiring sufficient talent. Maybe we apply a test, or HR informs us that there's an issue. So those would be risks that we would have to deal with. And then we also define the risk owners. So the risk owners are the ones that are going to be identifying the flags with you. They're also going to be measuring the outcomes of this project and determine if something gets tripped, right? So did something get flagged? Is this now a problem? And they need to raise that to the project manager so that you can respond. And they should also be able to recommend the countermeasures that are provided. So if we give them 4 countermeasures to choose from, they should be able to help you select the best countermeasure for the particular risk that's occurring. Now here's a risk countermeasure table. This is very similar, and notice this particular table is different than the first one. You could combine those and have them in one large spreadsheet or one tool, but I broke them out for sake of clarity. But the first column here, we have risk, which identifies the risk, and this is similar to the first column in the other table. We also have an owner column where we define the owner of this particular risk. We have a flag column, which is going to identify the measure that we use. We have the countermeasures and the cost of each of our countermeasures. So looking at our example, we have insufficient talent as the name of the risk. The owner of this is HR. So again, HR is the one that should be measuring this and also notifying us if there's a problem. We identified the flag as we have less than 20 applicants after 2 weeks in our HR system. So we have a project and we're hiring people, it looks like, and if we have less than 20 applicants, we're going to consider that a major problem. And we have some alternatives for that. The first one is, looks like we have a Ukrainian development team outsourced that we could bring in. And we also have alternative 2, we have looks like a California or Canada development team that we can bring in. Now the first one, so there's some benefits and some drawbacks. The first one has a 3-week delay. Not ideal, but probably manageable, and it saves us about $25,000 in the overall project. So not that bad. And then option 2 or alternative 2, outsourcing to the Canada or the California development team, will have a 12-week delay, but the cost will stay the same. So that might not be acceptable. But either way, based on these two outcomes, the project manager along with HR could then determine which countermeasure is the most appropriate. And of course, these are just two examples. You could have more countermeasures. For example, you could increase your advertising spending, trying to recruit people. You could increase your salaries, things like that as well. Is risk controlling. And with risk controlling, we're tracking all the project risks, and we regularly do this to reassess and reclassify our risks. And we also monitor and report the risk metrics. So again, at a high level, we track the risks. So again, we're using our tables that we created, our countermeasures table, as well as our risk table. And we regularly reassess and reclassify them, because something that may have been a high probability may no longer be high probability at a certain point in time. Also, the impact on the project may be reduced, or the time frame that the impact happens may be in the past. So all of a sudden, we're not able to hire the right talent. Well, now we're toward the end of our project. That may no longer be an issue, so that risk is moot, so we can drop that from a risk table. We no longer need HR to report whether we have 20 applicants or less in our system. We also monitor everything, so we receive reports that a particular flag has been identified from the risk owner, and these are things we'd evaluate in this phase. And then we also get the reporting in, right? So when a flag is detected, the owner will inform us, and also anybody else that's impacted by this, depending on how you've laid out the procedures for this particular thing, or the protocols when this happens or occurs. So we also have some risk management tools, and looks like, yep. So I forgot to mention one thing. When we're done with risk controlling, we also go back to risk identification, because we might identify new risks, and we want to include these in our plan as well. So let's go back to the risk management tools. The three major ones that you're going to have are going to be the risk management protocols. And this is what I've been referring to. So this is the documentation of your project that's going to define how you manage the risk processes. They also identify the risk thresholds. So again, what are you willing to accept? And they ensure that everything aligns with the rest of your project. So if quality is a threshold throughout your risk management, quality planning should also be a certain key component. Another tool that we have is something called the risk register. And this is a document that's going to track all of the risks, their consequences, their probabilities, vulnerabilities, and countermeasures. These are going to be tracked throughout the project, and we can refer to the risk register for prior projects or new projects and bring in risks that we identify. And the last piece, and this is what we'll be developing, is the risk management plan. So this is the document that's going to list out these tables that we've been talking about, the countermeasures, as well as the risk plan, and also the risk management protocols are going to be all part of this risk management plan. So now let me give you some pro tips related to managing risks in an IT project. So my first one is, if you spot a problem, fix a problem. So people don't like stress, people don't like conflict, but as a project manager, it's going to be your problem, right? You're the problem manager essentially, and it's your responsibility. So if something comes to you and there's an issue, you want to deal with that immediately and don't push it off and hope that things are going to get better. Again, people don't like to have conflict, especially if it's negative information you know is going to cause some stress and some headaches, or you might have some bad news for the sponsors. We need to get that information out, because you again are going to be held accountable for that. So you need to share that information immediately so that the countermeasures can be enacted. Now, a big other piece of this, of any project, is to have commitment from the project team. You want your project team members to want your project to succeed. And you really want to get your team members to understand that this project is part of a much bigger picture, and that risk planning is an essential component to eliminating or reducing risk. So we want them to take this very seriously and provide good information. This should not just be a sequence of steps that they do to fill in time or kind of check a box. You really want them to do a good job of planning out or identifying these risks and coming up with the countermeasures, because when these events do occur, you have a plan that you can go to and it's already been thought through. Now, another thing, once a risk, always a risk, right? So definitely recommend maintaining a risk repository for all of your future projects. So retain all the risk issues that you identify, capture them for either your organization or for you as a project manager. That way you can go back to them in the future. Now, another thing you need to do is overcome optimism. Everybody on your team, including yourself, is going to have optimism bias. So you're going to expect things to be better. Your estimates are going to be better than they really are. Your time estimates are going to be better. So you're going to identify less risks. You might rate less risks lower, the vulnerability, for example, than it really should be. So one thing you can do is bring in an external third-party auditor to review your risk plan. I think that's a really wise strategy. Now, to review, we looked at defining risk, and we looked at all of the attributes of risks. We also looked at the continuous risk management processes, and we talked about the 4 phases. We performed a risk identification process, so we looked at that table, and we put together a table of how to identify a risk, and also how to capture that on a table. We looked at using a risk probability impact matrix, so how to do a calculation, the high, medium, low, to identify the overall impact of that risk on our project. We also looked at developing a countermeasure table to help us identify ways that we can mitigate various risks. We looked at the steps of risk controlling. We talked about the 3 risk management tools, one of those which is your risk management plan. And I was sharing some pro tips that you can apply immediately in the workplace. So that's the overview of risk planning in the IT project management context. I hope this information is valuable to you, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.